Dodi, you know that I grew up in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, what was then Zaire. So from a very early age, I had a vaccination passport. And now I work in this industry where access to vaccines and adequate healthcare infrastructure matters a huge amount. So in this episode, we've got two really fascinating conversations from two parts of the patient healthcare workflow, access and diagnostics.
All right, so access in developing nations is what matters today on Discovery Matters.
Medical schools in the U.S. are rather expensive.
This is Dr. Jerome Kim, Director General of the International Vaccine Institute, or IVI. He's had the most incredible journey into infectious diseases.
So there was a program, because of the Cold War, that existed where if the U.S. government would pay for your medical school and give you a stipend and pay for your books, if you would pay back 1 year for every year that they paid. Luckily, the Air Force had a program where you didn't have to go directly into the Air Force. So I did my training at civilian institutions, Duke University, and got a grant and got another grant. And finally, I wrote to the Air Force and said, hey, can I stay and finish my grant at Duke? I'm, now on the faculty, et cetera. And I got this email back. You've managed to slip below the radar for too long. I'm going to send you to work at this Walter Reed place. They need a doctor who's interested in doing HIV vaccine research. And that's how I ended up working for the Army. So I was Air Force working for the Army. I worked with Bob Redfield, who eventually became head of CDC, and Debbie Birx, who became the Global AIDS coordinator and then the White House person for COVID, and did laboratory work and saw patients in the vaccine clinic, and eventually was sent to Thailand to take care of the phase 3 trial for HIV vaccines because I helped work to set it up and it was having some trouble and they needed someone who understood it. The vaccine was still and is still the only one to show protection against infection. It was only 31%. Then I retired from the military and joined IVI, and IVI works on a slightly different kind of vaccine. So HIV vaccines, we consider unincentivized. It's a huge problem. It's also the best funded of all the neglected diseases.
If you look at the funding for HIV, TB or tuberculosis, and malaria, you have 90% of the funding for neglected infectious diseases. Dr. Kim works on that other 10%.
That's what IVI works on and has been successful in taking vaccines from the laboratory through clinical testing, approvals, stockpiling, and establishment of a post-licensure mechanism for purchase and distribution. And so IVI has a natural interest in vaccines that we call unincentivized, vaccines that no major Western pharmaceutical manufacturer wants to touch because the profits are not sufficient to justify the significant amount of research and development investment that they would need to make. On the other hand, with funding from the Gates Foundation or the Wellcome Trust or others, we can take vaccines forward with developing country vaccine manufacturers, which are capable of manufacturing a high-quality product at a level that passes the World Health Organization pre-qualification requirements, and then get that vaccine used by countries around the world so that we have an impact on the disease we're interested in.
Now, we'll come back to the work of the Gates Foundation for the second interview of this episode.
Dr. Kim just said 90% of all infectious disease funding goes to HIV, tuberculosis, and malaria. Even you said it. I can't really get over that. To me, that's just an incredible number. And how does that span out in terms of populations affected?
Yeah, it's mind-blowing, and it's actually worse than you think.
Because that 90% is actually funded by governments primarily and by some philanthropic organizations. As you can imagine, the United States doesn't have a huge tuberculosis problem, so it's unlikely that a US-based vaccine company is going to invest a significant amount of money in testing and developing a tuberculosis vaccine. The last big company to be involved, actually, there are two kind of sad stories. One is the malaria vaccine that GSK, which is a major company and a great vaccine company, developed for malaria. The vaccine was efficacious at a level of about 50%. Funding for it dried up, and this is philanthropic funding largely, dried up, and the vaccine was stuck. The World Health Organization did not want to recommend it or approve it. And so people were wondering, is this a vaccine that we should use? And GSK was stuck with this vaccine that was efficacious, that many people said would save hundreds of thousands of children's lives every year. And it wouldn't move forward because there was no one who wanted to manufacture it. A 50% effect is not going to be convincing unless you have appropriate levels of effectiveness data, that is real world evidence that the vaccine actually does what it's supposed to do and is cost effective. And it took 3 years to do that. So malaria vaccine was waiting in the wilderness for 3 years. Hundreds of thousands of children died. But now it can be recommended and used. And it has been, and usage has picked up.
Can this be characterized as a problem of market failure?
Yes, this is exactly what it is. The lack of a financial incentive is an issue, but it's also about the different experiences of infectious disease between the nations with the resources and those without the resources.
There are some vaccines for conditions that exist in high-income countries, but for which no vaccines have yet been developed, and where there's not a lot of big company interest in developing a vaccine. Last year, there were a significant number of cases of scarlet fever in the UK, and also a significant increase in the number of cases of very, very severe streptococcal skin infections. They're all caused by the same germ, streptococcal pharyngitis. And in parts of the world that don't have access to good health care, people get a case of sore throat from group A strep. Then a few of them develop something called acute rheumatic fever. And after that, every single time they develop a strep A infection, they get a little worse case of this rheumatic destruction of the heart. So that by the time they're 20 to 30, they develop heart failure and die. And you'd think, wow, that doesn't sound very common. But in low and middle income countries, 300,000 people a year die of this. Those of us who've been parents know that all you need is a series of group A strep infections running through a nursery, and all of a sudden your child stays home from daycare and you have to take them into the doctor, and you can't take them back until they've been without a fever for 24 hours. In the high-income countryside, it's also a significant disease, and it's a significant disease from the perspective of parents because of time lost from work, of the visits to doctors. It's estimated that 50% of the prescriptions handed out by pediatricians are for group A strep, and 50% of them are not being prescribed, are being misprescribed. It causes significant overuse of antibiotics. It is a maybe $200 to $600 million problem in the United States alone in terms of total cost to the healthcare system. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have a major company working on it. Why? The way they estimate risk and the way they think about risk and benefit is different. So, we've done an economic analysis that would suggest that a strep A vaccine could potentially yield $4 billion per year to the company that develops the first one. Now, is that enough for a vaccine company? No, because they want to know what the risk of failure is. They want to know if there's a risk of complications.
Then it becomes a very different calculation. When a company is thinking strongly about developing a new vaccine, what they're looking at is the 90% risk of failure against a 10% chance that they might make $4 billion. For many of them, that is not a risk they'd like to take.
What if we were to encounter a disease which did meet all the requirements to incentivize a company to make a vaccine? So, for example, what if we thought about a large population in higher income countries being at risk, and this disease were to have a relatively high mortality rate and relatively high infectiousness?
Remember that COVID maybe killed 2%? Which is not terribly dangerous. Something that kills 2% of 8 billion people kills an awful lot of people. It's the ability of the virus to spread through the community, and then the number of people who get hospitalized, and then the number of people who die. And so there's a balance between those things in terms of what constitutes the greatest risk. If you look at the thing that causes strep throat, it kills 500,000 people. So 300,000 from rheumatic heart disease, which doesn't kill you right away, and then 200,000 from other sorts of infections that group A strep are involved in. That's a significant number. It may actually be the number 4 or number 5 greatest infectious disease killer among the different pathogens. The simplicity of developing a vaccine. So if it looks like people who get the disease are protected for life after they get it, like measles, then developing a vaccine may be relatively simpler than a disease like HIV, where you can be infected, and then while you're still infected, get reinfected and reinfected again. And then the viruses recombine and outsmart the immune system at every step. There are certain pathogens that are going to be more difficult. Finally, there are diseases like cholera and typhoid and others that kill between 100 and 200,000 people a year. Often they more often kill children than adults who, an adult living in Nepal may have been exposed multiple times or successfully survived multiple episodes of typhoid because they got to treatment in time or because they didn't have the severest manifestations of the disease. On the other hand, a 6-month-old who contracts it may have a very rocky time and may end up dying of typhoid or dying of cholera. So who makes those vaccines? Typically, these are what we call developing country vaccine manufacturers.
But the power of the purse is going to play a role.
It certainly will.
A vaccine against a disease called rotavirus, which causes significant diarrhea, is available in the U.S. It's actually been available in the U.S. since 2006 or 2007. And right after it was introduced, the number of cases of rotavirus dropped almost to zero. On the other hand, 60% of the world's children have not been vaccinated. Now, this is 16 years after it was introduced in the United States, 13 years after it was recommended and approved by the World Health Organization. It's just taken a long time for this vaccine to trickle down into low and middle income countries. So the companies that make the vaccine sell the vaccine for between $70 and $150 a dose in the US. And slightly less in Europe, but still at a reasonable price. In the developing world, you can't pay $100 a dose or $70 or even $50 a dose for a vaccine. And the organization that purchases and distributes vaccine, the two, Gavi and UNICEF, would go broke if they had to pay $50 a dose for vaccine. They get the rotavirus vaccine for $1.10 a dose because there are two Indian manufacturers competing against each other. And so these Indian manufacturers can make hundreds of millions of doses of WHO-approved, high-quality vaccines that prevent rotavirus infection. Great. But they don't make a lot of money on it. Merck and GSK do make a profit on their rotavirus vaccine, so they've recouped the R&D costs, which were substantial. What the Indian companies and other companies are doing is they're saying, well, that proves that it's possible. Now, if we make a similar vaccine and we start to sell it to Gavi or UNICEF, we can sell it for much less and we can vaccinate far more people. And that's exactly what they do. 60% of the world's children have received a vaccine made in India. And those vaccines that are available from Serum Institute or Bharat or Biological E or Panasia have really saved millions of children. The expanded program of immunization vaccines, the usual childhood vaccines, have saved 2.5 million lives a year since the decade of vaccines began in 2010. Now, if we were to fully implement vaccination all over the world with those vaccines, we'd save another 2.5 million. So that gives you an example of the scale and the impact of vaccination. At the same time, the infectious diseases for which no vaccines exist, and now this includes HIV, TB, malaria, and the rest, kill between 4 and 5 million.
There are major problems because of global morbidity and mortality, and we don't have vaccines that can get companies interested in them because those companies are thinking, well, those who are going to get tuberculosis will not be people in the United States or in Europe, but people in low and middle income countries, so they won't be able to afford these vaccines.
That is exactly why philanthropic and non-profit organizations are so important in the world of dealing with infectious disease.
Who ends up paying for this? Governments. High-risk research that's done by or philanthropic organizations like Gates or Wellcome Trust. The COVID vaccines, the mRNA vaccines would not have been possible had NIH not funded the more basic research around mRNA. And of course, the sad story is that, Kati Karako couldn't get funding from the NIH, which gets the idea that nothing's perfect. I mean, this was a brilliant idea, saved millions of lives, but she got fired because she couldn't get a grant to fund this work. R&D is very important. Who funds high-risk R&D? The R&D that makes a difference, maybe not tomorrow, but 5 years or 10 years or 15 years later, it's governments. And high-income country governments, the governments of Japan, of the European Union, of the United States and Canada, Australia, fund that kind of research. But for the things that kill people in the other parts of the world, you don't get the same attention. We don't get countries in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America having large enough amounts of excess capital so that they can make investments in research in infectious diseases.
If you think about the funding that the NIH puts in, it's developed this huge R&D ecosystem in the US and in much of the developed world. That R&D ecosystem underpins all the success that we've had in biomanufacturing technology. It is critical. So who does that for neglected diseases? Nobody. If we talk about African vaccine manufacturing, there's no system of funding that develops the scientists who focus on the key research questions around that, especially for diseases in low to middle income countries. No one can take it forward into a manufacturing step.
And beyond that, who is there to buy it?
Exactly. So it's frustrating for me, and I imagine, ministers of health in the developing world, the global south. So I asked Jerome how he felt in terms of the slow or failed approaches to neglected diseases, since he comes across just so optimistic when we talk to him.
There are several approaches to the mountain in front of you. You can push your rock up the hill, or you can be happy to advance one step at a time. And I think in global health, we see the hill and we can't get our arms around it. But as we make progress, and it's not only progress in health, it's progress in development that also informs advances in health. And being able to feed everybody, being able to provide people with clean water, being able to provide people with reasonable shelter, being able to provide people with education. We think of them as just development things, and they are related to health and vaccination. We know that if you vaccinate children, families stay out of poverty. We know that children's level of educational attainment is higher. We know that developmental and cognitive indices improve in vaccinated children. So the great improvement since the year 2000 with Gavi, with the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, has been 2.5 million more children survive every year because of vaccination.
Hopefully, COVID has taught us that health systems need to be strengthened. Vaccination systems could be better. And it's terrible that 20 million people died during COVID. In fact, people are still dying of COVID. But vaccines prevented an additional 20 million deaths.
Yes, and we have to be satisfied that there were people that we helped, and if you lose your sense of optimism, then you give up, and there is no time to give up.
We're making progress incrementally on a goal, and I think many people feel that. When I first went to Uganda, driving along the highway from Entebbe to Kampala, you pass these strip malls at little places with tiny little stores, and the biggest seller were the coffin, because this was the time when everyone died of AIDS. Now when you go, people are selling furniture and the stores. And now when you go to many of these African cities, you see these giant skyscrapers, and, there has been progress. It's been uneven. In many of the African major cities with chlorinated water, you can use water to make formula because it's safe. You go outside the city and you're better off having the child breastfed. So again, there has been progress, and Africa is making that progress. And yes, progress is uneven. Maybe what we can do is to allow other things to progress more rapidly, including strengthening of health systems and vaccination.
One of the really amazing things that IVI is doing is working on Africa's ability to run in-region, for-region manufacturing.
Absolutely, making it happen where it is needed.
Less than 1% of vaccines used in Africa are actually manufactured in Africa. So various groups have pledged $5 billion for vaccine manufacturing in Africa. All the things that go into that, the R&D ecosystem for vaccines before you actually have manufacturing, that is, the laboratories that help you to test the vaccine, the clinics that help you to conduct vaccine clinical trials, having appropriately mature regulatory systems that can actually say that vaccine is being manufactured at high quality and it's approved. Those regulatory systems don't exist either. If you're trying to start a new industry, how do you compete against a low-cost, high-quality producer like India? And so who's going to buy the vaccine and who's going to use the vaccine? Because, we had a situation where we were making antiretroviral drugs in Africa. They were more expensive. No one wanted to buy them. So we bought all the drugs from from Indian drug makers, and the African industry died. So again, if you're not thinking about vaccines as an ecosystem that starts with research and development, goes through manufacturing and approvals, and then goes to purchase and uptake, then you're creating a system that doesn't work. In AVA, we intend to create an African organization that can do what we do, that can take a vaccine that a university has, find funding from the Gates Foundation, move that vaccine through the laboratory, in through clinical testing, in through manufacturing and approval and uptake. But you need an organization that thinks end to end, and that doesn't exist in Africa yet. And so our big AVA project is to try to create an organization that's like IVI, that could be a competitor to IVI, that can do that, but that is located and is vested in Africa, that is local and strengthens systems locally.
So a big thank you to Dr. Jerome Kim
Yeah,
for
that was
sharing
great
that.
to
It was
hear
good,
from
huh?
him, yeah.
Real expertise on vaccine supply and development for infectious disease. But what about the diagnosis? Because it's one thing, being able to treat or be able to vaccinate against it, but how do you diagnose it? Dr. Kim mentioned the Gates Foundation. Let's let that lead on to our next guest.
My name is Karen Heichman, and I'm a PhD scientist, and I lead our diagnostics program at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we work within the Global Health Division, and we primarily focus on diseases that affect the world's poor and people that are underserved. So those include TB, HIV, and malaria. And in the case of COVID, of course, all hands on deck. We focused almost exclusively on COVID during the pandemic times.
Diagnostics is a really broad topic. How does Karen segment diagnostic modalities and think about them in terms of making them accessible to underserved communities?
Well, one of the biggest gaps in care cascade is the diagnostic gap, basically meaning that actually diagnosing is your biggest challenge in many cases.
Depending on the disease, there is some usually large fraction of people that actually go without a diagnosis and without a treatment at all. So in the case of tuberculosis, for instance, it's estimated that 40% of people that have a tuberculosis infection actually never get diagnosed and never get treated. In the case of malaria, it may be fully 2/3 to 70% of people are never diagnosed and never treated, which is really a criminal thought to have in mind, given that we have treatments that can treat these potentially lethal diseases and infections. So for us, what we want to do is be able to identify those people that have a treatable disease and be able to get the medicines to them. So our strategy is that while we have diagnostic tools that can be used for tuberculosis and malaria, for instance, they're not reaching all the people that they're meant to reach. And there's a number of reasons for that. One reason is that oftentimes people that seek care for these diseases, they have symptoms and they want to be treated, they don't come to the right setting for where the testing is performed. In the case of tuberculosis, a person in Africa might have to travel many kilometers to a complex laboratory or hospital setting, and that's really a barrier for people to get diagnosed. And so the idea is, in that case, bringing access means bringing the diagnostics to the people.
Diagnosis, of course, is part one, and then treatment is part two. Knowing what a patient has and then being able to treat that patient are two very different things.
Because you might have a country system that can deliver diagnoses but not treatment, or vice versa, a national system that can deliver treatment but cannot deliver a diagnosis.
Just being able to associate a person's test results and their specimen with themselves as a unique identifier so that that person can be brought into the care system. That's actually a really big bottleneck because we don't have a way to get medicines back to people if the medicines don't necessarily reside in the same places where the tests are done. So having specimen collection devices that have barcodes on them that can be read by a a mobile phone or a tablet makes it so that you can connect a person to their specimen and their specimen to a result and the result to potentially a pharmacy or a clinic or even a healthcare worker who could bring the medicines to a person's home. In South Africa, they have really great networks that keep track of people that are on antiretroviral therapy. And if that person doesn't come in for a viral load test, they don't come in to pick up their prescription, then a healthcare worker will be aware of that and will actually go to their home and make sure that that person receives medication and comes in for testing and then subsequent treatment. So it's super important to work within the government infrastructure to try to bring tools to the people. During COVID, I think we all learned that people can do actually a good job collecting their own specimen for certain specimen types. We started with nasopharyngeal swabs, which of course a healthcare worker had to collect. But we quickly learned that a nasal swab or saliva was something that people could collect in their own homes or their workplaces. And so we're looking to adapt existing diagnostics to use alternative specimens that people can self-collect, and in some cases, even do a self-test. In that case, again, you need to make sure that if a person gets a positive test result, they know what they need to do to get care.
As technology starts to enable more diagnoses, does Karen have a view on whether countries should be focusing on screening for asymptomatic disease or focusing on diagnosing an already symptomatic disease?
Countries typically are most interested in diagnostics that impact care. Treatments for COVID didn't come until very late in the pandemic. And in the case of getting a diagnosis, there wasn't necessarily a benefit to the individual to get a diagnostic test, right? But there was a benefit potentially to the community, to the family, to the workplace. If the biggest interest and the focus of the country is on containment of the infection at a public health level, then that may be a strategic question where they would want to apply diagnostics to being able to affect behavioral change to keep people limited and isolated. However, the World Health Organization and most countries emphasize diagnostics that have a treatment associated with them. So I talked about tuberculosis. There are antibiotic regimes that are out there. So people can get a test result and immediately initiate care. With malaria, it's a bit of a different situation where we're not at a place where in most places we're near elimination, where we're worried about spread so much, but we are worried about people that present with fever, that get very sick. And so I think prioritizing diagnosis to initiate treatment ends up being more important in that situation than limiting spread.
What Karen said here is really interesting, and interesting for me because I have personal experience of malaria myself and in my family. My mother, are you listening, Mum? Had malaria.
She's doing her ironing.
She is
of
doing
course
her
she's
ironing.
Listening. Hey, Gail.
Had cerebral malaria, and the diagnosis took rather a long time because nobody in the Netherlands, which is where she was when she was finally diagnosed, had actually seen a case like this in a long, long time.
High-income country.
High-income
where
country,
malaria,
not expecting to have malaria. So super interesting.
And as the world warms up, we are already starting to see cases of malaria in Southern Europe and the southern part of the United States.
There are parallels between the way the wealthy North responds diagnostically and the global South.
So you and I being in the wealthy North right now, how can our privilege help us stop the northward spread of malaria, noting that poorer nations have been trying to do that already for 60 to 70 years?
I think if you look realistically and kind of cynically at what happened during COVID, the high-income countries in the North basically monopolized the supply chain and the capacity that was out there. And that was particularly distressing for us, I can tell you. And we put a lot of effort and a lot of money in trying to develop manufacturing systems that could be much more highly scalable and low cost so that we could provide products to into the global south. And that's something that we still have underway and is still a priority for us. I think if we're thinking about things like malaria spread into the global north, what will probably end up happening is there will be screening efforts and tests that are required for travel. And I could imagine that there may be interest in identifying whether people are bringing malaria into the country. You can even test mosquito reservoirs, and you can test other things more environmentally than on the individual basis. But realistically, I think what may happen is that people in the global north would have mechanisms to test people that are coming into the country.
It's pernicious, isn't it? The progress that happens in the north is differentiated from what happens in the south. When the problem becomes real for individuals in the north, then we see action.
It becomes important, yeah, exactly. What keeps Karen so positive in the face of such insurmountable odds?
I'm a natural optimist. And even though through COVID, I was in the trenches trying to develop and scale diagnostic tools and specimen collection devices, I do have the hope that technology can help solve some of the biggest questions. Being able to find new tools that people can use to, as I said, collect their own specimen. Can we scale those appropriately, make them readily available? So pre-position collection devices with barcodes so that they're ready at the first sign of infection, that people can take control of their own healthcare by initiating diagnosis is one of the strategies that I think gives me hope that we can give more control into the hands of the people. The one thing too that we're thinking a lot about is manufacturing in the regions where the diagnostic products are meant to be used. And then you have more countrywide and regional autonomy to having products and manufacturing readily available. And so even developments that happen in the north can be technology transferred to countries and regions in the south. And hopefully they'll have their own ability to manufacture the products that they need the most and prioritize the tests that will make the biggest impact in their regions.
And this really is hopeful, right? Karen joined the Gates Foundation just before the pandemic, so she literally had to dive right in.
I have been working in diagnostics for the last 15 years or so, and I had an opportunity from a former colleague that was working at the Gates Foundation to take over his portfolio upon his retirement. And I really wasn't looking for a change. I had built a great team and I had a great job, but the potential for impact was so tantalizing that I just didn't feel like at this stage of my career, I could pass up an opportunity. And little did I know that a global pandemic where diagnostics and specimen collection were going to arise, and I would be faced with a critical challenge. But I would have to say it's the most rewarding thing that I've done in my career. The whole work that we did around nasal swabs as an alternative specimen type, we drove that entire work stream through the US FDA adopting it as a specimen type, getting the public good of all the information. The labs in the US adopted it. I shared information about the methods on a daily basis, many times a day, with the CDC, with the UK government, Canadian government, all my grantees in Africa, WHO, and to see something that you were a part of and have it really be applied to a health condition and emergency setting is kind of the dream. I would never wish for it again, but it really brought through my hopes for making a big career move like that.
Today, we've talked about the steps needed to improve access to healthcare in underdeveloped and lower middle-income countries. We've talked about two sides of the coin with vaccine development and supply, and then improving diagnosis. And I'm walking away from this conversation feeling that whilst it's still got a long way to go to where it would be if it was equitable, that important steps are being taken. What are you walking away with, Dodie?
Well, both of the scientists we spoke to today are optimistic. So the closer you are to this topic, apparently, the better you feel about it. So I'm feeling hopeful.
Maybe we should get closer to the topic and dive in a little bit further and feel even a little bit better.
I mean, our own Biopharma Resilience Index shows these gaps between the global north and the global south. So it is a topic that will take a long time to solve, if ever it is solved. But it's certainly a topic that is rich for discussion.
It is. It is. So now, why don't we turn to our Every Day is a School Day section?
Yes.
Our regular section.
Shall I go first or you?
What have you learned this week?
Well, I saw a nice article in neurosciencenews.com that is appropriate for the Every Day is a School Day section, and it's about dopamine. And it's about the role that dopamine plays in encoding both reward and punishment errors in the human brain.
And so was me just thinking dopamine was just reward.
Exactly. It's just that social media feeling of when everybody, when people like your post and you feel that rush, that's dopamine. But this study actually looks at how does dopamine encode both reward and punishment in the human brain very, very fast. It happens very fast. So I thought that was kind of cool.
That is very cool. Talking about reward receptors in the brain. I've been listening to a really good podcast for quite a while now.
It's called Discovery Matters.
It is indeed. And the other one that I also listen to, from which we take some inspiration, I've got to say, is one with Wendy Zuckerman called Science Versus. And Wendy has just done an episode on caffeine.
Oh, cool.
And the effects of caffeine and whether it's good or not and so on and so forth. And one thing that I didn't know was that caffeine doesn't do something to give you an extra bit of zing. It just stops you from being sleepy. So caffeine binds to receptors in the brain which would otherwise be bound to by adenosine, which is the neurotransmitter which makes you feel sleepy. So by blocking that neurotransmitter from being bound to in the brain, it stops you from being sleepy. So there is, in fact, a point at which no more caffeine is going to keep you more awake, which is when all of your adenosine receptors are taken up with caffeine. And then coffee is just going to make you want to, well, depending on your genetics, maybe go to the loo a bit more.
Maybe you know what? I'll drink to that.
I'm sticking with my shots every day.
Totally. Our producer is Beth Armett Brewster, editing, mixing, and supervision by Banda Productions, music from Epidemic Sound. My name is Dodie Axelson. I'm grateful that you've been listening.
And I am Connor McKechnie, also grateful. Make sure you rate us on Spotify or whichever platform you use. It helps us somehow. We'll be back soon with another episode of Discovery Matters.